there, Star Wars collectors, and welcome to another Bosk's Bounty video. So I thought it was about time that I made an update to my Finish the 96 series, due to Hasbro actually releasing some figures in 2025 that have been long-standing absentees from the vintage collection, and that also go towards finishing the original Kenner 96. I've also had many requests to do an update on this video. It was actually pretty much just over a year since the previous episode. I think it was in August 2024 that I last made an episode of Finish the 96. So please, if you happen to enjoy the video, hit the like button down below, subscribe if you are new, and just to let you know, there will be links in the description below for the figures that we are still missing from the vintage collection. They are links to the best version of the figure that we currently have, whether that's from the Saga collection or even in some cases from the Power of the Force. So with all that being said, let's get into this. Alright, so last time I made one of these videos, I actually filmed it using my cabinet of the vintage Kenner figures, but this time I'm going to be going back to how I used to do it, using this awesome image provided by the guys over at Red 5, who are the guys behind the awesome collector's book and many posters and things like that. So from left to right on the top row, we are going to look at the Stormtrooper. We have the Stormtrooper in the vintage collection, no problem there. We also have the Echo Base Soldier. We have Leia. We now have Ben Kenobi, old Ben, in the vintage collection. He actually was released in 2025, the same as Han Solo as well next to him, so that is great. Two that we can tick off that we weren't able to tick off before. I think last year when I made this video they were pipelined, but we still couldn't tick them off, but we now have them. The Death Squad Commander has been made in the vintage collection, although it's a slightly different version. He's not in his grey outfit, but it's still the classic card back with a version of that figure, so we are going to be ticking him off. FX7 is the first figure on this list that we are still waiting for a modern interpretation on that classic card back for the vintage collection. The best version of this figure that you can currently get is from the Power of the Jedi line, and in all honesty, that figure was reissued in the vintage collection, but it is part of one of those 3-packs, so we still don't have him as a carded figure. Hammerhead, we now have in the vintage collection. Unfortunately, is on the slightly larger card. If you want the smaller, normal sized card, then you're going to need to get the figure from the Adventure playset, the Cantina Adventure playset. It's the Kenner coloured figure in that instance, but it is the classic card back. Ponda Baba, or Walrus Man, we've had him for a long time in the vintage collection from TVC 1.0. If you want the original classic card back, once again from the Cantina Adventure playset. Tusken Raider, or Sand People, we have him in the vintage collection. C3PO, now this is a contentious one as always. We do actually have him in the vintage collection. We have him on the Empire Strikes Back card. Unfortunately, we don't have him on the first 12 Star Wars card, but we still do have a C3PO in the vintage collection, so unfortunately we do have to tick him off. IG-88 is another figure that is missing from the vintage collection. You have to go way back to 2006, 2007 for the vintage Saga collection. That is currently the best version, and once again, I'm pretty sure that that figure was reissued in the vintage collection into one of those 3-packs, but we don't have him on his own card in the vintage collection proper, and if they did release a IG-88, I believe it would need to be an updated figure. We can't go back to that older version. R5D4, we have him in the vintage collection, no problem there. Moving on to the Ugnaught. Now this is one where you have two options, both from the Legacy collection, slightly different figures, but we do not have an updated Ugnaught in the vintage collection on that classic card back, and they really kind of missed the opportunity with that one when they gave us the carbon freezing chamber. So I can't really see, when they're going to get round to that figure, but yeah, you've got two options if you want an Ugnaught for your playset. The Jawa, we have him in the vintage collection. We also have the Power Droid, which is great. Yoda on the ESB card, we have him. Luke Skywalker in his X-Wing outfit, we have that in the vintage collection. We also have the Death Star droid as well. Moving on to Bosk, now very similar to IG-88, one of the bounty hunters from the Empire Strikes Back. We do not currently have that figure in the vintage collection. Yes, once again, in the vintage Saga collection, he was released on that classic card back, but he's not in the vintage collection proper, and that figure as well needs a serious update. R2-D2 on the classic card, we now have a clean version in the vintage collection, so that one is most certainly ticked off. And next to him is Luke Skywalker from his Tatooine outfit, and of course we do now have him in the Vintage Collection, released in 2025 alongside Ben Kenobi and Han Solo. Awesome to finally tick him off. AT-AT Driver. Unfortunately, we still do not have a modern version of the AT-AT Driver in the Vintage Collection with that awesome classic card back. Moving on to Han Solo and his Bespin gear, we do have him in the Vintage Collection, although, you know, again, a pretty old figure. We would like an update of him. But as far as this list goes, he has been made already. Lando Calrissian, we all know about him, Mr. Peg Warmer himself. We most certainly have him in the Vintage Collection. And we'll move on to the next C-3PO. Now, this is one that we do not have. We do not have a removable limbs C-3PO on that classic Empire Strikes Back card with Chewbacca. We do not have that in the Vintage Collection, so he definitely cannot be ticked off. Big red cross for him because, yeah, as I say, we're still waiting for that one. Greedo. We now have a modern interpretation of Greedo in the Vintage Collection. He was part of the HasLab. We don't currently have him on his classic card back. Again, if you want that classic card back, then you need to go to the Cantina Adventure set. Again, you will get Greedo in his Kenner colours on that card back. But I'm pretty sure at some point in the future, Hasbro will come to their senses and, you know, get Greedo out in some way on that classic card back for all of the people that weren't able to get the HasLab Cantina. Moving on to Princess Leia Organa in her Bespin gown. We most certainly have that figure in the Vintage Collection. Standing next to her is the Hoth Rebel Commander. We most certainly do not have that figure in the Vintage Collection right now. Lobot, most certainly we can tick him off. And then Han Solo in his Hoth gear. Again, we have had a vintage style card in the Vintage Saga Collection for Han Solo in his Hoth gear, but we do not have a super articulated modern figure in the Vintage Collection for him, and it's another one that desperately needs updating. There's a few we can tick off from now. We've got the AT-AT Commander, Boba Fett, although the ESB Boba Fett really isn't good enough now, Chewbacca, and we also have that version of the Bespin Guard as well. All four of those are in the Vintage Collection, so we can tick those off no problem. Moving on to 2-1B, again, this is one that has been released in the Vintage Collection in one of those 3 packs, but I'm pretty sure that figure dates right back to the Power of the Force even. So we definitely need an update to 2-1B on that classic Empire Strikes Back card if we want to finish the 96. Next up, we've got the red Snaggletooth. Now, on previous videos, I have counted Zutton as being the red Snaggletooth, even though they didn't release him on that classic card back. Now, they have actually released that card back once again in that Cantina Adventure set. However, they painted him blue and released the blue Snaggletooth on that card back. So once again, will we ever get a red Snaggletooth on that classic card back? Probably not, but as I said, I will be ticking Zutton off as counting towards that figure. Dengar, we definitely have him, VCO1. He was the first character in the Vintage Collection proper, and he's also been reissued since then as well. But then we move on to the Imperial Officer in his black uniform. Now, this one is a bit of a strange one because essentially in the original Kenner line, that card back is of General Veers, and he is actually wearing a grey uniform. That's on the card back. However, the figure that they packed in was the officer in the black uniform. So it depends what you really want here. I actually think it would be quite nice if Hasbro went back and fixed Kenner's mistake by releasing General Veers in his grey uniform on the Imperial Officer card back. But then again, we also do need that Imperial Officer in his black uniform in the Vintage Collection. We have had him in 2 packs and things like that, but essentially we're still missing him on a card. Next up, we have Luke Skywalker in his Bespin fatigues. We've most certainly got that figure in the Vintage Collection, VCO4. He's been reissued as well. Having said that, the figure is in desperate need of an update, but for this list, he is most certainly counted. And then next up, we have the Imperial Stormtrooper in his Hoth battle gear, which we do have in the Vintage Collection, once again released in 2025. Awesome release. Most certainly ticks off that one, which we haven't been able to do on previous videos. The next 3 figures we have had released in the Vintage Collection, so that's Leia Hoth, Luke Hoth, and the Bespin Guard. Now, the Bespin Guard was released on a slightly different card back, but the figure itself does match, so we most certainly can tick that one off as well. And then we're on to Forlom or Zuckuss, whichever way round you want to put it, we do not currently have him in the vintage collection. The most screen accurate version that we currently have of him is from the Legacy collection, although you can get the Kenner color versions of Forlom or Zuckuss, whichever way you want to say, in that vintage collection Bounty Hunter 2-pack, where you also get Forlom. But as I said, he is in the Kenner style colors. Moving on to Darth Vader, we definitely have Darth Vader from A New Hope, definitive version of Darth Vader, so he is most certainly ticked off. We also do have the Cloud Car pilot, and we also have Zuckuss. We also have the TIE Fighter pilot, although that figure desperately needs updating as well. And then we're on to R2-D2 with Sensor Scope. We definitely have that figure in the vintage collection as well on the classic Empire Strikes card back. We also have Admiral Akbar, and we have Lando in his Skiff Guard disguise. And then moving on to Chief Chirper, we do not currently have Chief Chirper in the vintage collection, and you'll have to go all the way back to the Saga collection for a version of Chief Chirper. So again, one that needs updating. Wee Quay, we have him in the vintage collection. We also have Logray and Reese, and a version of the Rebel Commando. We also have Nien Nunb as well, and he was also reissued for the 40th anniversary of Return of the Jedi. Next up, General Madine. We most certainly do not have this figure in the vintage collection. Let's be honest, everybody, it would be a pretty boring release, but essentially we do need General Madine in the vintage collection, and you have to go way back to, I believe it's the Trilogy collection, for like a half decent version of General Madine. Hardly any articulation on that figure, but you know, in terms of screen accuracy, that's probably as good as you are going to get. Moving on to the Gamorrean Guard, we've definitely got him. He's been reissued a few times as well. Scout Trooper, we've got him. He actually was packed in with the speeder bike. Next up is 8D8, and I think at the time of recording this video last year, he was pipelined to be in that Jabba set. I'm pretty sure that it was soon after that everybody got that figure in hand, so he can definitely be ticked off from this list. Han Solo in his Endor jacket, we have him as well. And we also have Pruneface, or as he's named in the vintage collection, Orin Marco. Princess Leia in her Endor outfit, we have her. We also have the Klaatu Skiff Guard and Wicket. We also have Bib Fortuna. So the next one that we actually need is the Rancor Keeper, and you have to go back to the Legacy collection for that figure. Pretty good figure, that one. Probably too late for them to just reissue that one. We probably need a bit of an update for that figure, but you know, the Rancor Keeper is not in the vintage collection on that card back, so he gets a big red cross. Luke Skywalker in his Jedi Knight outfit, we have him in the vintage collection. Also the AT-AT driver and the Emperor and the Emperor's Royal Guard. We also have the other Klaatu, which is named Woof, in the vintage collection, and we also have Princess Leia in her Bouche disguise. So that moves us on to the B-Wing pilot. We do have him in the vintage collection. He is named Kian Farlander in TVC, and we have Tebow. We also have Squidhead. He was released on a card back in that awesome 4-pack that contained Velkin Tazeri, and that means we move on to the first of the last 17, which is Evie 9D9, and we most certainly do not have her in the vintage collection. You have to go all the way back to the Power of the Force line to get that figure, and I think I've said this on previous videos, I actually prefer the vintage Kenner version. I still think that that is the best version of EV9D9 that we have in figure form. Moving on to R2-D2 with pop-up lightsaber. Now essentially we do not have this version of R2-D2 on the classic card back from the Kenner days. However, we do have an R2-D2 on the Return of the Jedi card. It is kind of the same figure. You know, he's nicknamed Bar2-D2 because he obviously comes with those bar pieces around his head. So this is one that is like a maybe. Can we tick this one off? Can we not? Do we need a new version of R2-D2 for that pop-up card back? Moving on to Han Solo in Carbonite, we definitely have that figure. He was released alongside Reese, both on cards as part of the Jabba's Palace Adventure playset that we got way back in, what, 2019 now I think it was. So then we're going to move on to Warwick. Now this is an interesting one because you can get a modern version of Warwick, not in the vintage collection though. He was part of a Battle of Endor set. He was the one that came with the glider. But as I said, we do not have Warwick in the vintage collection, and we don't have him on a card back, so he is definitely a red cross. Same can be said for the Imperial Dignitary, aka Simalu. We definitely don't have him, and there is no modern version of Simalu. He is the only figure on this list that hasn't had a modern update. Moving on to Romba is another Ewok that we do not currently have in the vintage collection. So together with Chief Chirper and Warwick, Romba is the other Ewok that is missing, and you can get a modern version of Romba, but he is in a 2-pack in the 30th anniversary, so still a long time ago. Definitely one that needs updating on the proper card back. To the right of Romba we have Barada. Now for me this one has not been made in the vintage collection. I know we have Kithaba, and Kithaba that was released is actually painted the same colour as this figure with the red pants or trousers, but Barada actually had blue, I believe. So we need an updated version of Barada on the Barada card back, if that makes sense. So for me, this one most certainly has not been done. General Lando, we have him in the vintage collection. He was released in TVC 1.0 and reissued in TVC 2.0. Next up, this is one that I'm pleased to say that we now do have in the vintage collection. It is the Anakin Skywalker Force Ghost. He came recently in that 3-pack, and I guess the hope is that he gets reissued outside of that pack on the classic hardback. It would be so funny to see that classic hardback make an appearance in the vintage collection. So yeah, fingers crossed for that one, but I guess we can tick the figure off, but maybe not the card back. Next up is Luke Skywalker in his Stormtrooper disguise. We have him. We also have the Death Star Gunner, and we have Luke Skywalker in his Endor gear as well. Next up is the A-Wing pilot. We definitely don't have him in the vintage collection. And once again, you have to go all the way back to the 30th anniversary for a version of the A-Wing pilot. So once again, one that does need to be made in the vintage collection. Only 4 figures to go now, so we're on to Paplu. We have him in the vintage collection. A Manaman, we most certainly don't. And if you want a figure of a Manaman at this moment in time, you need to go all the way back to the Power of the Jedi. It's like a slightly larger pack. I think it was a fan's choice release. He comes with some skulls, and he also comes with Salacious Crumb as well, if I remember correctly. However, that species has been seen in a recent trailer for the Mandalorian and Grogu film, so who knows, will we get a new Manaman in the line? Fingers crossed for that one. Moving on to the last 2, we have both of these in the vintage collection. We have Lumat. He was released in TVC 1.0. I think he is VC 104. And we also have Yakface, aka Salt Murray. And we have 2 versions of him, one on the Return of the Jedi card and one on the Power of the Force card that came with the barge. So that completes the list. I'm just going to tot up the numbers to see how many I feel that we need to complete the 96. Okay, so that was a lot to get through, but I count 21 figures from the 96 that Hasbro still need to make in the vintage collection. But of course, there are a few discrepancies in there. It's like, you know, we have the figure, but we don't have the card back, or the other way around. You know, we have a Kenner color version of Forlom, for example, but we don't actually have the actual figure, that kind of thing. But the ones I'm counting, we actually need 21 of the 96, which is pretty good, I reckon, because I remember when I made the first episode of this series, we were well into the 30s that we needed. So Hasbro are getting to them, of course. In this last year alone, we've had Luke, Han, Ben Kenobi, we've had the Imperial Stormtrooper Hoth battle gear, you know, and then in previous years, they've done some of the others as well, like the Emperor and things like that. So they are getting to them. But I just think that some of these, you know, will we ever get an Amanaman, for example? Will we ever get Simalu? You know, these things are up in the air. We just don't know if we'll ever get them. We did get the Anakin Skywalker Force Ghost, which is a good one. Hopefully we get him on the card back. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And out of those 21, which one would you like the most for Hasbro to make next? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you to my Patreon supporters and channel members. As always, your support means a great deal to me and is greatly appreciated. So thank you so much. Thanks for watching, everybody, and we shall see you on the next one.